When I saw my parents struggling with their old car, I knew exactly what I wanted to do, because for years I had watched them sacrifice for us, putting our needs above their own, never spending a dime on luxuries, always making sure we had enough, and yet never once asking for anything in return, which made it all the more painful to see them driving around in a vehicle that rattled like an old shopping cart every time it hit a bump in the road. So I made a plan, one that required months of careful saving, extra shifts at work, skipping out on little pleasures, all for the sake of giving them something they would never buy for themselves, a brand new car, something safe, something reliable, something that would finally make their lives easier after years of struggle and sacrifice. The day I drove up their driveway, my heart was pounding with excitement, because I had envisioned this moment so many times, imagining the look on their faces when they saw what I had done, the joy, the gratitude, maybe even tears in my mother's eyes as she realized she would never have to worry about the old car breaking down in the middle of the road again. I parked the car in front of the house, took a deep breath, and stepped out with the biggest smile on my face, holding out the keys like they were a winning lottery ticket, ready to soak in the happiness that was supposed to follow. My father was the first to step outside, his brows furrowing in confusion as he took in the shiny new car, his mouth opening slightly as if forming a question he wasn't sure he should ask, while my mother followed close behind, drying her hands on a kitchen towel, pausing on the front steps as her eyes flickered between me and the car, something unreadable crossing her face before she smiled, a small, polite smile, the kind you give a neighbor who just returned your mail by mistake. I started talking fast, explaining how I had saved up, how I had thought about them every step of the way, how I wanted them to have something safe, something new, something they deserved after all these years of giving everything to us. And then, before I could even finish, my mother let out a small hum, reached for the keys in my hand, and without missing a beat, turned to my brother, Mark, who had just stepped outside, rubbing his eyes like he had just woken up from a nap, wearing that same lazy smirk he always had when he was about to get something handed to him without lifting a finger. She tossed the keys to him like it was the most natural thing in the world.
Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Like it was already decided before I even arrived, like my efforts, my work, my sacrifice, meant absolutely nothing compared to whatever he might need at this moment. And then she said, in the most casual, dismissive tone I had ever heard, "He needs it more than us." I felt the air leave my lungs, my mouth opening slightly as my brain scrambled to process what had just happened. But before I could even find the words, Mark caught the keys, grinned, and said, "Oh, hell yeah. Thanks, sis," before strolling over to my gift, sliding into the driver's seat as if it had always belonged to him, adjusting the mirrors, running his fingers over the wheel, completely oblivious to the way my hands were clenched into fists at my sides. I forced a smile, swallowing down the sharp sting in my throat, nodding along as if this was all perfectly fine, as if I hadn't just been slapped in the face with a lifetime of second place, as if I wasn't reliving every moment where I had worked, earned, and sacrificed, only for Mark to waltz in at the last second and take whatever he wanted without so much as a thank you. My father stood there awkwardly, shifting his weight like he wanted to say something but didn't dare, and my mother, with that same small smile, turned back toward the house as if the matter was settled, as if I was supposed to simply accept that my generosity had been rerouted, repurposed, and reassigned to the only person who apparently ever needed anything in this family. So I smiled. I nodded. I let them think I was fine. I even let Mark take it for a spin, watched as he pulled out of the driveway with my car, laughing like this was the best thing that had ever happened to him, without a single ounce of gratitude beyond that lazy, half-assed "thanks, sis" that he had tossed at me like a spare coin. I let it all happen, let them all think I was the same obedient, responsible daughter who never made waves, who always put family first, who always let things go. But the next day, I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and with a few clicks, I canceled the registration. If Mark wanted a car so badly, he was about to find out what it really meant to own something. The phone rang early in the morning, piercing the quiet of my apartment, and for a brief second, I considered ignoring it, assuming it was just another spam call or maybe work trying to drag me in on my day off. but something in the way it rang, sharp, insistent, almost impatient, made me reach for it, pressing the phone to my ear as I mumbled a half-awake "Hello." The voice on the other end was clipped and professional, the kind of tone that immediately makes your stomach tighten because you just know it's about something serious. And when the words finally registered, I felt a slow, creeping satisfaction settle in my chest, because this was exactly what I had been waiting for. "Ma'am, we have a report of a stolen vehicle registered in your name," the officer said, pausing as if waiting for my reaction, maybe expecting panic, confusion, or outright denial. But instead, I let out a soft, thoughtful hum, shifting the phone to my other ear as I forced my voice into something light, something curious. "Oh, really?" I said, pretending to frown as if this was the most shocking news I had ever heard. "That's strange. Let me check." I could almost hear the officer taking notes, the slight hesitation before he spoke again, probably already realizing that my reaction wasn't exactly what he had expected, but I played it cool, dragging the moment out just long enough to let the implications sink in, because if Mark thought he could just take what was mine without consequences, he was about to learn a very painful lesson about ownership. There was a pause, and then the officer cleared his throat, his voice a little firmer this time, as if testing my reaction. "So, you are the registered owner of the vehicle in question?" he asked, and I let a small, knowing smile creep across my face before I answered, my words deliberate, careful, and exactly what they needed to be. "Yes, officer," I said, leaning back into my couch with an almost lazy satisfaction. "That car is mine. My name is on the title, and as far as I'm aware, I haven't given anyone permission to take it." The silence stretched just long enough for me to picture the scene unfolding on the other end of the line, the flashing red and blue lights, Mark standing there looking confused and outraged, probably running a hand through his hair like he always did when he was trying to weasel his way out of trouble, our mother right beside him, voice pitched high with frustration as she demanded to know why they were even being bothered with something so ridiculous, her arms folded tightly across her chest, as if sheer indignation would be enough to make the problem disappear. And my father? I imagined him standing slightly behind them, quiet, hesitant, avoiding eye contact with the officers because deep down he knew that this wasn't just some misunderstanding, that I hadn't done this by accident, that I wasn't the type to let things go so easily anymore. The officer sighed, the kind of tired, exasperated sigh that told me he had already dealt with people like Mark before, entitled little brats who thought the world owed them something, who thought they could just take and take without consequence, and for a brief moment, I almost felt bad for dragging law enforcement into something that, to an outsider, might have seemed like nothing more than a petty family dispute. "All right, ma'am," he said finally, his tone shifting into something slightly more careful, something a little more neutral. "Your brother, Mark, is claiming that you gifted him the vehicle and then revoked ownership out of spite. He says he has witnesses, your parents, who can confirm that the car was given to him as a present. Do you have any response to that claim?" I nearly laughed, shaking my head at the sheer audacity, because of course they were doubling down. Of course they had all decided that my generosity wasn't something I had control over, that once I had given something, it was no longer mine to take back, no matter how it was ripped from my hands. But I had anticipated this. I knew they would pull something like this, and that's why I had made sure that every single piece of paperwork, every official document, every legal record still had my name on it. I kept my voice even, my tone light, as if this was nothing more than an amusing inconvenience. "Well, officer," I said, standing up and pacing toward my window, staring out at the street below as I let the weight of my next words settle in. If Mark had actually received that car as a gift, wouldn't his name be on the title? Wouldn't he have the registration under his name? Wouldn't there be some kind of legal documentation proving ownership? Another beat of silence, and then I delivered the final blow, the one I had been waiting to say since the second my mother tossed him the keys like it was his to claim. "You see, officer," I continued, my voice dropping just slightly, "I never signed anything over to him. Which means, legally speaking, that car is still mine. And if someone is driving around in a car that doesn't belong to them, well, isn't it usually called theft?" The officer exhaled sharply, and I could practically feel his patience wearing thin, not with me, but with the situation, with my brother, with the entitled, spoiled brat who had somehow convinced himself that he could lie his way out of this. "Understood, ma'am," he said, his tone shifting into something more decisive now, something that told me this was about to become Mark's problem, not mine. "We'll be in touch if we need any additional information." When I hung up the phone, I let out a slow breath, feeling something cold and satisfied settle in my chest, because for once, finally, they weren't going to get away with it. But I also knew this wasn't over yet, because if there was one thing I had learned growing up in this family, it was that Mark never faced consequences without trying to drag someone else down with him. If they thought I was going to roll over this time and just accept my place as the one who always let things go, they had another thing coming. The second I stepped into my parents' house, I knew exactly what kind of battle I was about to walk into, because the air was thick with that heavy, suffocating tension that always came before one of my mother's self-righteous lectures, the kind where she talked in circles until I either backed down or gave in, and as I stood in the doorway, watching her cross her arms over her chest with a disapproving glare already aimed directly at me, I braced myself for the inevitable. Mark was sitting on the couch with his arms stretched across the backrest, looking as smug as ever, like he had already decided that this was just a minor inconvenience, just another little obstacle he could manipulate his way through, while my father sat quietly in the corner, staring at his hands as if he wanted nothing more than to disappear into the floor. The moment my mother opened her mouth, I could already hear the condescension dripping from her tone, the same tone she used every time she needed to make me feel like the unreasonable one, the difficult one, the selfish one. "I don't know what you were thinking, canceling the registration like that," she said, shaking her head like I was some unruly child who had broken a house rule, rather than a grown woman who had been blatantly disrespected. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused? Do you realize how embarrassing it was to have the police show up over something so ridiculous?" I didn't answer right away because I knew she didn't actually care about why I did it. She only cared about the fact that I had the audacity to stand my ground, to disrupt the carefully constructed family dynamic where Mark always took, and I was always expected to quietly endure it. Instead, I let my gaze shift to Mark, who had the nerve to roll his eyes, his lips curling into a lazy smirk like this was just another petty squabble he'd win in the end. "You're being dramatic, sis," he said, his voice oozing with that same entitled indifference that had infuriated me for years. "It's just a car." That was it. That was the moment something inside me snapped, because for the past 24 hours, I had been trying to figure out why this particular betrayal hurt so much more than all the others, why this one moment of disregard had cut deeper than every childhood slight, every time I had been pushed aside, every instance where my efforts had been minimized or ignored. And it hit me like a truck. This was never about just a car. This was about years of my contributions being seen as expected, about every time I had worked myself to exhaustion while Mark coasted by on excuses and second chances, about the way my sacrifices were taken for granted while his smallest inconveniences were treated like life-altering disasters. I let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking my head as I finally met my mother's gaze, and when I spoke, my voice was eerily calm, because I knew if I let myself really feel the anger bubbling beneath the surface, I wouldn't be able to stop. "It's just a car?" I repeated, arching a brow as I crossed my arms, mirroring her stance. "Then why was it so easy for you to hand it over to Mark the second I gave it to you? If it was just a car, why was it so important that he have it instead of you? If it was just a car, why did I have to be the one to pay for it, to work for it, to make sure it existed in the first place?" My mother's lips pressed into a thin line, but before she could launch into another lecture, Mark scoffed, shifting forward to rest his elbows on his knees, clearly growing impatient with the fact that I wasn't immediately caving like I was supposed to. "You're acting like I stole something from you," he said, throwing his hands up in exasperation, his voice full of that same indignant disbelief that always surfaced whenever someone dared to suggest that he wasn't entitled to something. "You gave the car to them, not to yourself. So, what if Mom decided to pass it to me? It's not like you were planning to use it." I clenched my jaw, my hands curling into fists at my sides as I inhaled sharply, forcing myself to stay composed even as the anger simmered dangerously close to boiling over. "It's not about me using it, Mark," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. It's about the fact that you think you're owed something just because you exist. It's about the fact that you think everything I do, everything I work for, everything I give, is yours by default. Mark rolled his eyes again, clearly bored with the conversation, clearly assuming that this was just another argument that would blow over in a few days, but what he didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that I was done. I was done being the one who always let things go, done being the one who swallowed my pride and made peace just to keep the family together, done pretending that any of this was okay. I turned back to my mother, who was watching me carefully now, something flickering behind her eyes that almost looked like doubt, but it was too late for that, too late for second guesses or half-hearted attempts at reconciliation. If it's just a car, then you shouldn't have a problem with the fact that I still own it, I said, tilting my head slightly as I let the weight of my next word sink in. And if Mark really thinks he deserves it, he's welcome to go buy one himself. Let's see how far entitlement gets him when he has to actually work for something for once in his life. Mark scoffed again, shaking his head like I was being ridiculous, like he couldn't believe I was making such a big deal out of something so trivial, but the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched just slightly, told me that he knew. He knew that I wasn't backing down this time. And then, just as I turned to leave, just as I was ready to walk out and let them all stew in the mess they had created, Mark did something I never expected. He tried to get back at me. I thought that maybe, just maybe, after our last conversation, Mark would finally understand that he couldn't just take whatever he wanted without consequences, that for once in his life, he would have to accept that not everything was going to be handed to him just because he expected it. But of course, I should have known better, because Mark had never faced a real consequence in his entire life, and he wasn't about to start now. The letter arrived 2 days later, tucked neatly inside a plain white envelope with the return address of a local law firm, and for a second, I just stared at it, my brain struggling to comprehend what I was looking at, because there was no way, no possible way, he had actually gone this far. But the second I opened it and read the first line, my blood turned to ice, because there, in black and white, was the unbelievable truth. Mark was suing me. I had to read the words 3 times before they actually sank in, before the sheer absurdity of what he was trying to do fully registered in my mind. My own brother had gone to a lawyer, filed an official complaint, and was now claiming that I had committed fraud by gifting him the car and then illegally revoking his ownership out of spite, essentially accusing me of stealing my own property. He was demanding that the vehicle be legally transferred into his name, along with an additional claim for damages due to the emotional distress and financial hardship my actions had supposedly caused him, and as I stood there holding that ridiculous document in my hands, I felt something inside me snap in a way that I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. I didn't even realize I had started laughing until the sound echoed through my apartment, sharp and humorless, because it was either that or start screaming, and I wasn't entirely sure I would be able to stop if I did. The sheer audacity of it, the absolute nerve of this man to twist the situation into something where he was the victim, where I was the one at fault for daring to take back what was mine, was so unbelievable that it almost didn't seem real. But it was real, and if the legal jargon in front of me was anything to go by, he had no intention of letting this go quietly. I knew I needed a minute to process before I reacted, but I also knew that there was one conversation I wasn't going to be able to avoid, because there was no doubt in my mind that my mother already knew about this, that she had probably been standing right beside him when he made the decision, that she had most likely encouraged him to fight for what she still believed he deserved. And sure enough, before I could even decide what to do next, my phone rang, and when I saw her name flashing on the screen, I almost didn't answer, because I already knew exactly how this conversation was going to go. But against my better judgment, I picked up, pressing the phone to my ear and bracing myself for what was coming. "I assume you got the letter," she said, her voice tight with irritation, as if I was the one making things difficult, as if I was the one blowing this entire situation out of proportion, and for a long moment, I just let the silence stretch between us, because I needed a second to contain the absolute fury bubbling just beneath the surface. "Tell me you're joking," I said finally, my voice calm in that dangerous way that only ever happened when I was barely holding myself together. "Tell me that you didn't actually let him do this, that you didn't stand by and watch while your son dragged his own sister into court over a car he never owned." My mother let out a long, dramatic sigh, the kind she always did when she was about to launch into one of her guilt-tripping monologues. But this time, I wasn't going to let her talk her way out of it, wasn't going to let her twist things into something that somehow made me the villain. He was desperate, she said finally, her voice taking on that infuriatingly patient tone that always made me feel like a child being scolded for something I didn't even do. You put him in a bad spot, and he felt like he had no other choice. What else was he supposed to do when you took away something he was relying on? And there it was, the confirmation I had been expecting, the proof that no matter what Mark did, no matter how selfish, how manipulative, how outright deceitful he was, my mother would always defend him, would always twist reality to make it seem like he was the real victim. It didn't even matter that he had blindsided me with a lawsuit. Didn't matter that he was actively trying to take something that legally belonged to me, because in her eyes, I was still the problem. I inhaled slowly, gripping the phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white, because I needed to stay calm, needed to keep my voice steady, needed to make it absolutely clear that I was done playing these games. Let me make something very clear to you, I said, my voice so cold that I almost didn't recognize it as my own. I don't care how desperate he is. I don't care how much you think he needs that car. If he thinks he can drag me into court and win, he's in for a rude awakening. Because I'm not backing down. I'm not letting him take something from me just because you think he should have it. And if you really want to side with him on this, then you'd better be prepared for what comes next. Because if he wants war, I'll give him war. I hung up before she could respond, my entire body shaking with the sheer force of my anger, because this wasn't just about the car anymore, wasn't just about the lawsuit or the legal battle that was now looming on the horizon. This was about every single time I had been expected to step aside for Mark, every single time I had been told to be the bigger person, every single time I had swallowed my pride for the sake of keeping the peace. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to do it. If Mark wanted to fight me for something that was never his, then I would make sure he regretted every single second of it. Sitting in that cold, lifeless courtroom, staring across the table at my brother, who had the audacity to sit there looking smug as if this whole ridiculous lawsuit was just another minor inconvenience he would soon talk his way out of, I felt a level of exhaustion settle into my bones that I wasn't sure I could ever shake. The judge hadn't even entered the room yet, and already I could feel my mother's gaze burning into me from where she sat beside Mark, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression carefully neutral in that way it always was when she was trying to act as though she wasn't taking sides, even though we all knew exactly whose corner she had planted herself in. My father sat a little farther away, his shoulders hunched, his hands folded in his lap, looking for all the world like a man who wished he could be anywhere else but here, and for a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for him, because I knew deep down that he probably did want to say something, probably did want to step in, but he never had before, so why would he start now? The sound of the judge's entrance pulled me from my thoughts, and I straightened my shoulders, forcing myself to focus, because this was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment where all of Mark's lies, all of his manipulations, all of his self-serving deceit were about to come crashing down around him, and I was going to make sure I enjoyed every single second of it. The judge took her seat, glanced over the paperwork in front of her, and then turned her gaze toward my brother with a sharp, no-nonsense expression that instantly told me she wasn't here for games, wasn't interested in the petty dramatics Mark had no doubt planned to pull, and when she finally spoke, her voice was as steady and controlled as the gavel she had yet to touch. Mr. Carter, your claim states that the defendant gifted you the vehicle in question and then revoked ownership without just cause, she began, adjusting her glasses as she flipped through a few pages of legal documents, her brow furrowing slightly. You are seeking full legal ownership of the vehicle as well as financial compensation for the alleged damages caused by the defendant's actions. Is that correct? Mark leaned forward, clasping his hands together as if he actually thought he was going to charm his way through this, his voice oozing with faux sincerity as he nodded and said, "Yes, Your Honor, that's correct. My sister gave me the car, and then, out of nowhere, she canceled the registration and reported it as stolen, which caused me a lot of unnecessary legal trouble. I lost work because of it. I was left without transportation, and it's honestly just been a huge headache for everyone involved. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing at the sheer performance he was putting on, because if nothing else, Mark was always good at making himself look like the victim. But what he didn't know, what he was about to find out in the worst possible way, was that I had come prepared. My lawyer, a sharp-witted woman named Rebecca, who had seen right through Mark's nonsense the second I told her about this case, stood up and cleared her throat, her expression unreadable as she picked up a thick stack of documents and approached the judge's bench. "Your Honor, if I may," she said smoothly, sliding a printed transcript of text messages across the table before turning to glance at Mark with an almost amused expression. "I have here a series of messages sent by the plaintiff in which he discusses his plans to sell the vehicle in question for personal financial gain. These messages were sent before my client ever revoked ownership, which, I believe, contradicts the plaintiff's claim that he was using the car as his primary source of transportation." Mark's entire posture stiffened, his smirk faltering just slightly as the judge picked up the documents and began reading through them, and for the first time since this nightmare had started, I saw something flicker behind his carefully constructed mask, something that looked an awful lot like panic. My mother shifted uncomfortably beside him, her lips pressing into a thin line as if she was suddenly realizing that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't going to be the easy victory they had assumed it would be. But before either of them could say a word, Rebecca spoke again, her voice calm but firm. "Furthermore, Your Honor," she continued, flipping to another set of documents, "we have uncovered additional financial records that indicate the plaintiff has accumulated a significant amount of debt, much of which appears to have been co-signed by the parents of both parties. Given that these debts were not previously disclosed, and considering the plaintiff's documented attempts to sell the vehicle in question, we have reason to believe that the defendant's mother knowingly transferred possession of the car to her son with the intent of assisting him in liquidating an asset to pay off his outstanding financial obligations." The room went completely silent, and for the first time in my life, I watched as my mother's face drained of all color, her carefully composed demeanor cracking right before my eyes as the weight of what had just been exposed settled between us like a suffocating fog. Mark was staring at the table, his jaw clenched so tightly that I thought he might break a tooth, but it didn't matter, because I already knew what the truth was, and now, so did everyone else. "Is this true?" the judge asked, her sharp gaze snapping toward my mother, who opened her mouth as if to deny it but then quickly shut it again, her shoulders sagging as if she had suddenly realized that there was no easy way out of this. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking down at his hands like he always did when he didn't want to be a part of the conversation, but I didn't care, because this wasn't about him. This was about her, about them, about the fact that they had let me believe I was crazy, had let me believe that this was just another case of Mark getting what he wanted, when in reality, it had never been about the car at all. It had been about them trying to cover up yet another one of his mistakes at my expense. I took a slow, steady breath, my hands clenched into fists at my sides as I stared across the room at the people who were supposed to be my family, the people who were supposed to care about me, and in that moment, I realized something that I probably should have realized a long time ago. I wasn't their daughter anymore. The courtroom was unnervingly silent as the judge read through the final ruling, her voice steady and authoritative, each word sinking into my skin like the last piece of a puzzle finally snapping into place, confirming what I already knew in my heart, but still needed to hear out loud. My brother had lost. The car was mine. There was no gray area, no loophole, no last-minute technicality that would save him from the consequences of his own entitlement, and as I sat there, staring straight ahead while Mark slumped back in his chair like a petulant child who had just been denied dessert, I felt nothing but an overwhelming sense of exhaustion, the kind that settles deep in your bones when you realize you've been fighting for something that, in the end, was never really worth it. I could feel my mother's gaze burning into the side of my face, but I refused to look at her, refused to acknowledge whatever desperate expression she was probably wearing, refused to let her manipulate me into feeling guilty for something that was never my fault to begin with. She had spent weeks defending Mark, twisting reality to make him the victim, choosing his comfort over my dignity, and yet now that the verdict had been handed down, now that there was no more fight left to be had, I knew exactly what she was about to do. She was going to reach for me, going to play the "we're still family" card, going to beg me to just let this go because, in her mind, no matter what Mark had done, no matter how much he had taken from me, I was still supposed to be the one who forgave, the one who made things right, the one who swallowed my pride for the sake of keeping everyone together. And I wasn't going to do it. Not this time. The moment court was adjourned, I stood up without a word, ignoring the way my mother leaned forward as if she was about to grab my hand, ignoring the way Mark scoffed under his breath like this was just a temporary setback, ignoring the way my father, silent as always, lowered his gaze, unwilling to meet my eyes because he knew exactly what this had cost me, knew exactly how wrong they had all been, knew exactly how much he had failed me by standing aside and letting it happen. I didn't wait for them. I didn't linger to hear whatever excuses they were going to throw at me. I simply walked out of that courtroom and never looked back. By the time I got home, I had already made my decision. The car, the very thing that had ignited this entire mess, the thing I had once purchased with the purest of intentions, the thing that had been twisted into a symbol of everything ugly and broken about my family, was something I no longer wanted, no longer needed, no longer had any emotional attachment to. It was tainted now, a constant reminder of betrayal, of entitlement, of just how little I had ever truly mattered to the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, and I refused to let it sit in my driveway like some kind of trophy for a war I never should have had to fight in the first place. I called the dealership the next morning, arranged for the car to be sold back at a slight loss, and when the money was deposited into my account a few days later, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. I made a single donation, every penny of it, to a local women's shelter, a place that helped young girls escape toxic home environments, a place that provided resources for people who had spent their whole lives being undervalued, underappreciated, and emotionally drained by the people who were supposed to protect them. And when the transaction was complete, when I received the confirmation email thanking me for my generosity, I sat back in my chair and let out a long, slow breath because for the first time in my life, I had taken something that had once been used against me and turned it into something good, something that actually mattered. I thought that would be the end of it, that I would finally be able to close this chapter and move on, that I would never have to hear from them again. But of course, my mother had other plans. The message came late at night, a desperate plea disguised as a guilt trip, her words carefully chosen to tug at whatever fragile threads of obligation she still thought existed between us. "Please don't do this," she wrote, as if I was the one who had been cruel, as if I was the one who had taken something that wasn't mine, as if I was the one who had forced a family member into a legal battle over pure greed. We're family. No matter what's happened, we shouldn't let something as silly as this tear us apart. I stared at the message for a long time, rereading it over and over, feeling absolutely nothing but a quiet sort of clarity, because for once, I wasn't struggling with my decision, wasn't second-guessing myself, wasn't feeling that all-too-familiar guilt that had kept me trapped in this cycle for so many years. I didn't even hesitate before responding, my fingers typing out the words before I had the chance to think too hard about them. "No. You're Mark's family. I was just the wallet." And then I blocked her number. I blocked Mark's number, too. I blocked my father's, even though he had never once reached out, even though I knew he never would, even though part of me still wished he had at least tried to be different. I blocked them all, and when I woke up the next morning, I felt lighter than I had in years, like I had finally cut off a weight that had been dragging me down for far too long, like I was finally free. Months passed. The silence stretched on. And then, one day, a single email arrived in my inbox, the sender's name making my stomach twist, even though I told myself I didn't care anymore. It was from my father. No subject line, no long-winded apology, no attempt at fixing what was already shattered beyond repair. Just one sentence. I should have spoken up. I stared at the words for a long time, feeling absolutely nothing, no anger, no sadness, no relief, just the quiet, empty realization that maybe, in some other version of my life, those words might have meant something. Maybe if he had spoken up sooner, things would have been different. Maybe if he had ever chosen me instead of choosing silence, I wouldn't have had to walk away. Maybe. But now? It was too late. Months passed, and with every week that went by without a single call, text, or unwanted visit, I found myself slowly settling into the kind of peace I had never truly known before, the kind that wasn't just about distance, but about finally understanding that I was never obligated to be a part of something that only drained me. Cutting them off had been the hardest thing I had ever done, not because I missed them, not because I had any lingering attachment to the people they had chosen to be, but because I had spent my entire life believing that family was supposed to mean something, that no matter what happened, no matter how bad things got, there would always be some unbreakable thread tying us together. But the truth was, that thread had been fraying for years, long before I finally had the courage to sever it myself. I built a life without them, a life where I no longer had to be the responsible one, the overlooked one, the one who was expected to sacrifice without ever being appreciated. I worked, I traveled, I made new friends, I surrounded myself with people who actually valued me, who didn't just see me as a convenient resource to be drained whenever they needed something. And for the first time, I started to feel whole, like I was finally someone outside of the expectations my family had placed on me. The scars were still there, of course, buried beneath layers of old wounds that had never quite healed right, but at least now, I wasn't pretending they didn't exist. And then, just when I thought I had finally left it all behind, another email arrived. This time, it wasn't from my father. It was from my mother. The subject line was blank, but the second I saw her name, a familiar heaviness settled in my chest, that old instinct kicking in, the one that had always told me to brace myself, to prepare for the inevitable wave of guilt, of manipulation, of carefully crafted words meant to pull me back in. I almost didn't open it, almost deleted it without a second thought, but some part of me, some small, bitter part that still wanted to know why, made my fingers hesitate over the screen before finally tapping to open the message. I don't know if you'll even read this, but I wanted to try. Mark is struggling. He lost his job. He's behind on rent. Things have been hard for all of us. I know you're still upset, and I know you think we chose him over you, but we were only trying to help him when he needed it most. You've always been the strong one, the responsible one, the one we never had to worry about. Maybe we didn't say it enough, but we appreciated you more than you'll ever know. I don't expect you to forgive us, but I hope you'll at least consider coming home. You're still my daughter. You always will be. Please don't let this be the way it ends. I stared at the words, my pulse steady, my breathing even, waiting for that familiar pang of guilt to settle in, for the old wounds to reopen, for something inside me to soften the way it always had before. But it didn't, because I knew exactly what this was. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't regret. It wasn't even love. It was desperation. She didn't reach out because she missed me. She reached out because Mark was finally dealing with the consequences of his own actions, because for the first time, he was the one struggling, he was the one they had to worry about, he was the one who needed saving. And now that they had no one left to turn to, now that they had backed themselves into a corner, now that they finally realized that maybe, just maybe, I had been the one holding everything together all along, suddenly I was worth reaching out to. But it was too late. I didn't bother responding. I didn't need to. I blocked her email just like I had blocked her calls, just like I had blocked every other reminder of a life I no longer wanted any part of. And as I shut my laptop, as I stood up and stretched, feeling nothing but the quiet relief of knowing I was finally free, I realized something. They had spent years making me feel like I owed them something, like I was supposed to keep giving even when I had nothing left, like my love and loyalty were conditions they got to set. But love isn't supposed to feel like a debt you can never repay. And I didn't owe them anything anymore. Not my time. Not my forgiveness. Not even a response. It was finally over.